You, Lindley. I'm going to share my screen now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. That is not what I want. Oh, share. Let's see. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. This is working. Great. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I think most of you know me. I'm Dale Skaggs. I'm Director of Horticulture here at the Dixon. And this is an interesting topic for me. And I just want to sort of have a little disclaimer at the beginning. I approach this mainly as a curious gardener. I'm certainly no religious scholar. I have no training in that, but I'm merely trying to understand what plants are being discussed in particular Bible stories. You know, I suspect some are merely metaphorical and it really doesn't matter what the plant species, but I think others are deeply rooted in history. And so this is my attempt at understanding. There's about 128 species of plants found in the New and Old Testaments. And some of them, like the grapevine, everybody knows what a grapevine is, so there's no problem in understanding what plant they're talking about. But there's other much debated species like the rose and the apple, and there's a lot of speculation about those. And I suspect one reason is the fact that theologians and botanists don't necessarily see the world in the same way. And biblical scholars are probably not necessarily keen on plants, and they're not, you know, they're not plant folks. So, but one thing that I learned doing this is in trying to put these plants into context is there's going to be confusion. And hopefully after you view this, we'll all be confused and you'll be confused on a higher level. So even the experts disagree. I had 8 resources and a couple of web-based resources in order to put this presentation together, and there was discrepancies all over that. So the task of exploring this plants of the Bible seems like a pretty simple and straightforward topic, but it's as complicated and splintered as Christianity itself. If you think about how many versions of the Bible exist today, there's over 100 in English alone, and how many different forms of Christianity there are. There's a lot of debate and differing opinions, and it's not just limited to plants. So as I mentioned, there's about 128 individual species that have been identified, referenced to in the Bible. And today I'm going to talk about 31 of them. So starting with this map of the climate, you know, in the Bible, rain and drought and all of these weather, famine and hunger, you know, they appear a lot in the Bible. And so I think famine and drought and these things were probably some of the most feared disasters, probably right up there with locust forms, I would imagine. But I just wanted to point out that this is a Mediterranean climate. And to define a Mediterranean climate, it has 2 seasons. It has a mild, rainy winter and a hot, dry summer. And in the book of Genesis, they talk of cold and heat, summer and winter. And so that's kind of what you have in the lands that are referred to in the Bible. The rain varies with latitude and altitude, but if you can look, it's pretty much where you grow grapes in the world. Where the grape vineyards are, that's where the Mediterranean climates are, if you think about it in that way. So I'm going to start talking about the 7 species. In the Old Testament, you know, they talk about the different. Most of the 7 species are mentioned. They have played an important role in the food of the land of Israel, and they play heavily into the traditions of Judaism. And references to these foods are found throughout the Bible. And in Deuteronomy, they talk about a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. Note 6 of the 7 species are mentioned here. These were important species to Israel and that part of the world. So starting with the Genesis story, Genesis 1:12, the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which their seed according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So we're going to start talking about the 7 species, and we'll go into a little bit more detail because they're mentioned a lot and they're sort of important. This needs no introduction. This is obviously the grapes, and an important, historically important fruit that obviously wine is made from. I mean, this goes back to the beginnings of man's history, its relationship with this vine and the fruit. That about 3,000 years BC, they found pips of grapes in northern Greece. So it's been cultivated for a very long time. The Vitis sylvestris, which means Vitis sylvestris means plant of the woods. Anytime you see sylvestris, it's referring to woodlands. So that one was native to Southern Europe. So these were probably species of that wild plant that were cultivated. But interestingly enough, the vines were actually unknown in ancient Israel. And this shows as one of the 7 important plants, but in ancient times, it was not really known in Israel. The Bible refers to, sort of the vintage season, which was the yearly feast when the grapes were harvested. And so they became, there's symbolisms for bounty. And when grapes aren't bearing, it's more about sadness and desolation. So it's used a lot as metaphor in the Bible. At one point, the vine was regarded as a national emblem of Israel, even though it wasn't cultivated in ancient times. And as I said, it was one of the 7 species which the land was blessed. There are just a huge number of words in the Bible are associated with the care of these plants, with planting, pruning, vintage, wine production. So it's throughout the Bible, grapes are very important. In the New Testament, spiritual meanings are attributed to the vine, and the most significant of them is recorded in the book of John when Jesus identifies himself with a plant. He says, "I am the true vine, and the Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that bears no fruit, he cuts away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes to make it bear even more." So that's sort of emphasizing the significance of the grape. Let's talk a little bit about grapes primarily in the Mid-South. You can grow some grape varieties here. They're not the best for making wine, but you can grow grapes here. As I said, Mediterranean climates, we have too much heat and humidity. There's a lot of mildew and fungal issues and problems with trying to grow grapes here. But the fig, on the other hand, although it's borderline hardy, if you select the right varieties, figs do well here. So I found this parable in the Bible, in the book of Luke, and I thought it was very fitting. It could happen today at the Dixon. So I'm going to read this to you, this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. He said to the vine dresser, "Look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down. Why should it use up the ground?" Well, a lot of times when there's trees here that are declining at the Dixon, I'm always thinking, we can save them. We can save them. And Kevin is very keen on what the grounds look like. And often he'll say, we should probably have that removed. So this is like an answer that I would give him. It says, and he answered him, "Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around and put on it manure. And then if it shall bear fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." So he's given this tree a second chance. And so it's kind of like me saying, Kevin, I'm going to get Adam, who works here in the garden, to put some of his magic compost tea on it. And anyway, I thought that was a fitting story. But figs are very important. It's the first fruit to be mentioned in the Bible in the story of Adam and Eve. It's been cultivated 5,000 years BC. They found remnants of it in archaeological digs. It was also grown in ancient Egypt. And it was a big part of nutrition in biblical times. It has, they would press it into cakes and store it for the fruitless season, kind of like you would a raisin. And It's among the 7 species, symbolizing prosperity and peace. It's believed that the wild plant in northwest Turkey is the ancestor of the fig. And whoa, sorry, got a little ahead of myself. All right, like I said, it's borderline hardy here, but you might try, if you want to try your hand at growing figs, brown turkey is a good cultivar. Hardy Chicago is another one that works pretty well. There's one called Brunswick. There's one called Celeste, and there is also, why am I jumping around here? Sorry. Violette de Bordeaux is one that we had in the plant sale. It's supposed to be one that's good for containers, like on a patio or something. So, so all of those are supposed to be among the hardier end of fig trees. They like it a little south of us. There's zone 8 plant. All right, let's talk about another plant that you can actually grow here. This is the pomegranate. In the Quran, pomegranates are mentioned as one of the provisions of Allah, who sends water down from the sky, which we bring forth the buds of every plant. From these we bring forth green foliage, close growing grain, palm trees laid with clusters of dates, vineyards, olive groves, and pomegranates. In the Quran, he's mentioning there's 5 of the 7 gifts from God that are mentioned in the Quran that were so celebrated that we're talking about now in Judaism. So it wasn't unique to Judaism as well. You know, a drink is made from pomegranate, and even today we sort of celebrate the health benefits of pomegranate. How many of you have had a pom drink that's has pomegranate juice in it? And the juice contains a chemical that's being investigated to be beneficial in cancer research. So it's also used in ink and in tanning clothing and as a dye plant. Although it's numbered among the 7 species for which the land has been blessed, it was not as big of a part of the staple diet during biblical times like the date or the fig. Like I said, it was used for both food and art. They come in several places in the scriptures, most notably Solomon's temple as a garland on the pillars of the temple. It's supposedly had 200 pomegranates engraved on the capitals of the 2 pillars, which were at the front of the temple. So a significant plant, no doubt. Another plant that was hugely significant is the date palm. And it's one of the region's most ancient fruit trees. It's a tree of desert oasis and cultivated about 4000 BC. The palm trees and the leaves were used in King Solomon's temple engravings. The Maccabees used the palm as an emblem on their coin, and Roman coins depicted a woman seated under a palm as well. So significance illustrated there. The plant is common in many gardens even today, and often people will take the seeds from commercial dates and plant them and grow them in their garden. Apart from the palm having a spiritual role and its spiritual imagery through the Bible, it had many practical uses. The fruit is sustaining, and it's still a mainstay for tribes in Arabia and Africa. You can get juice from the trunk. A tasty juice can be made. The leaves were woven into baskets. The wood was used for fences, roofs, and rafts. So it's a very, very useful plant, one of the 7 blessings on the land. And here's the fruit here. It's grown commercially for fruit in the United States in Texas, Arizona, and California. And the high sugar content, like the fig, makes it great for drying and storing. So having fruit off season without refrigeration is a big deal. Probably second to the grape is the olive tree in number of times that it's mentioned in the Bible. And it was very, very significant. It grew among the rocks on rocky, stony soils, and they're scattered on the mountain slopes of Galilee today. The olive was one of the 7 species of the land. It abounded in biblical days, both in the mountains and in the coastal plains. Interestingly enough, the olive leaf symbolizes peace. And ever since the history of mankind, extending the olive branch, you may have heard. The tree was immensely popular because of its fruit, and apart from the daily diet, the oil was used as an ointment, when you anoint heads with oil or for anointing the sick. They also used it for a light source, for burning lights. The oil was used to light oil lamps, and it was used as a solvent of various spices and incense and perfumes and cosmetics. The wood was very, very nice. It's richly grained and dense, and it's great for household utensils. And interestingly enough, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, where oil presses, there were oil presses located there, and the site was called Gethsemane, and Gethsemane means oil press. So the Garden of Gethsemane was obviously a garden of olive garden of oil presses. It grows all over the Mediterranean, wild, and in Israel. Olive pits have been found at various excavation sites, so it's definitely historically and still is today an important crop. It's a zone 9 plant for us. You really can't grow it. We planted them here at the Dixon and grown them in containers, and they're really attractive. We don't ever get any fruit on them. It's kind of a zone 9 plant, I guess. It probably below 25 degrees is going to kill it outright. But there are some cultivars that are hardier than others. And doing a little research, there's one called Arbaquina, there's Arbosana, and Koroniki. Those are among the toughest varieties if you wanted to try your hand at growing an olive tree, but you're going to have to bring it in indoors. And here's the beautiful fruits. All right, there's 2 grains that are mentioned as 7 species. It grew, this grain is wheat, and it grew wild in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, where life began, most scientists agree. Early wild wheat would shatter, so they started selecting. This is the first time that people are actually selecting plants for cultivation that we know of that's documented. So early wheat would shatter, so so they started selecting grains that wouldn't shatter so that they could actually harvest them so they wouldn't fall to the ground. It has a higher protein than most other grains today. There's over 3,000 cultivars of wheat that exist today, and they're all derived from 14 different species. It's by far the most traded grain in the world. And this is the other grain that is mentioned, and apparently the translation from Hebrew means long hair and refers to the long hairs on the head of grains. This again is one of the 7 species which the land was blessed. It's always been kind of considered inferior to wheat. It was kind of the poor people's bread. You made barley, made the poor people's bread. It was limited to areas with not much rainfall. But it's been cultivated longer than wheat, about 8,000 years BC. It's cultivated today as, a lot of it's used barley. You feed the livestock. But it's always been a staple food among the poor working men. And when people were in these sort of famines or things, they would actually eat a lot of barley. I happen to like barley because you make beer out of barley. The legend is that in Egypt, Osiris taught the Egyptians how to make beer. There's 2 forms that they make beer with. One is 2-row malt, which means there's 2 rows of these kernels, and 6-row has six rows of the kernels. And historically today, most ales are made out of 2-row, and most lagers are made out of 6-row. But in order to use it, they malt it. And the malting process, they basically spread the grain out over a floor or a surface. They moisten it, and they let it sprout and germinate. And this releases enzymes that actually convert the sugars the starches in the grain to fermentable sugars. So, and the more they roast it to stop that sprouting process, the darker the grain gets, and that's how you get darker colored malts. It's by more roasting. But that's the process, at least in England, how they have done malt for both whiskeys and for beer. All right, so that covers the 7 gifts of the land that were important to. They're noted as being important to Judaism, but they also, as I pointed out, the Quran, and just for sustaining life in general, these were important plants. There's a lot of confusion on plants, and there's a lot of things that are legends and stories that you really can't validate through the Bible. And so I put this plant on here. This is a plant that's native to the New World. This is the passion vine, or passiflora. This particular one is the maypop, native to Shelby County. This is Passiflora incarnata. And the reason that I have this up is because Jesuit missionaries were converting indigenous peoples to this species of passion flower all through the Americas. This just happens to be the one native to Shelby County, but Jesuit missionaries would convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism, and they like to use props. And so this made such a great prop because there were so many metaphors here. The purple color was remindful of the color of lint. It had a central pillar to the center. There's 3 stigmas that symbolize the 3 nails that were used for the crucifixion. The 5 anthers were supposedly the 5 wounds that Christ sustained. There's references to a crown of thorn in here. Anyway, they even say the leaves look like the spears that pierced his side. So there was a lot of storytelling that you could do with this. In fact, there were pamphlets made to teach missionaries how to use this as a tool to convert more earth-based religions to Christianity. So I suspect the reason that I have this in here, not because it's a plant of the Holy Land, but I suspect just like this, a lot of plants, legends and things were created surrounding plants for this purpose. So I always grew up hearing that a dogwood tree was basically what the cross was made of that Christ was crucified on. The real story is a little bit, it's actually just a legend. The Bible nowhere tells us the story of the type of wood that the cross was used, nor, Romans made a lot of crosses, and it doesn't say, there's no history on how the crosses were made or if there was a preferential type of wood. So this is a legend that it was made of dogwood. Dogwoods don't get big enough really to be a cross, but there's a legend. So nobody knows who wrote this, but there's a legend that is circulated that I learned growing up with dogwood trees. And so anyway, but this is kind of a little bit debunking the myth. But if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read this. It's fairly short, but it says, in Jesus' time, the dogwood grew to a stately size and lovely hue. 'Twas strong and firm, its branches interwoven. For the cross of Christ, its timbers were chosen. Seeing the distress at the use of their wood, Christ made a promise which still holds good. Never again shall the dogwood grow large enough to be used so. Slender and twisted it shall be, with blossoms like a cross for all to see. As blood stains the petals marked in brown, the blossom's center wear a thorny crown. All who see it will remember me, crucified on a cross from the dogwood tree. Cherished and protected, the tree shall be a reminder of all my agony. Again, this is a nice poem, but there's no biblical basis to it. And they appear to be covering their tracks in the fact that a dogwood tree doesn't grow big enough to make timbers by saying, that this is sort of a curse that was put on it. But the other real fact is, I'm going to go back. The other real fact is that there's no species of dogwood that would have been native to the Holy Land for them to use. So again, this is a legend that was probably used for evangelical purposes. All right, a plant that is hotly contested in the Bible is the apple, and it's obviously the apple is assumed to be the original sin in Genesis and the Adam and Eve story. But the cool temperatures that required growth of an apple were probably not there, and the constant arid conditions. You would need irrigation to grow apples in the land of the Bible. So scholars suggest that the apple of the scriptures was really either an apricot, which is here, or possibly a quince, or maybe even the pomegranate. But it was definitely another fruit tree other than the apple. But again, there's a lot of controversy over this. Anyway, the botanists think that it was probably an apricot. This is the apple here. Ancient Egypt had some apples. So and Pliny the Elder refers to apples. So and there's some that grow wild in Turkey. So there's still some confusion on whether the apple was actually an apple or an apricot. And some have suggested that it was this plant, which is a Cydonia, which is it's called quince, which is a common name that most people know. The flowering quince here is a multi-stem shrub. This is a tree called Cydonia, which is the quince, and it has enormous fruit. And the Cydonia oblongifolia is a good chance that it would have tolerated the conditions, and it looks very much like an apple, but it doesn't turn red, it's yellow. And beautiful flowers on that. I actually I pulled this off the web, but beautiful flowers on the Cydonia. All right, how about the burning bush? Moses and the burning bush. I know as a horticulturalist, we often use Latin names, and I think a lot of people think we're just kind of being snobbish or arrogant to use these Latin names, but I just want to point out that it's really essential to avoid confusion with the common names. If we had the Latin names in Carl Linnaeus' system in the Bible, we would know exactly what plants we were talking about. But common names only confuse even in modern times. The burning bush, the plant that we call burning bush, is Euonymus alatus, or winged Euonymus. And it's called burning bush because it really lights up with the fall color. But the actual burning bush in the Bible is thought to be a Rubus, which Rubus is the genus of blackberries and loganberries and raspberries. They're all Rubus. And so this is a wild Rubus that would have been growing in Israel and all over the lands of the Bible. So they think that this was the actual burning bush. Excuse me. All right, let's talk about Cercis siliquastrum. It's kin to our redbud tree, and it's referred to as the Judas tree. And the origin of the common name is contentious. Some people say Judas tree is a corruption of Judean, and then others say it was the tree from which Judas hung himself. So, but notice it even has a heart-shaped leaf, much like the heart-shaped leaf of our redbud, and the flowers are very similar. But this is the lands of the Bible. This would be a native tree. Here's the fruit on it, very similar to ours. The siliquastrum is a Latin term that refers to the shape of that fruit. And then here is our dogwood tree. And if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you can see its distribution is all over the southeastern United States. But it too has a heart-shaped leaf. It has the fruit. There are numerous cultivars of it. It is a great garden plant for us. The bark is nice. It gets to be a pretty good-sized tree. So there you have it. There's one in bloom over at the Memphis Botanic Gardens that I took years ago. It's actually a legume in the pea family, as you can see by the blossoms. Out of all the trees in the Bible, the cedar tree is mentioned probably more than any. And it was an important construction material. Like cypress and redwood, it has a natural tendency to resist decay. It makes it very desirable as a building material. And cedar was widespread, and there were a lot of cedars grown, but it was continually harvested. It was used for construction of houses and household items. The fabled cedars of Lebanon, they're sadly, I think most of the cedars of Lebanon are not there anymore, but there are some, the original, I think there's a few alees and a few groves that have been preserved in spite of their, I think it's even on the flag, the Lebanese flag, but it's throughout the Bible, it's mentioned this cedar. The cedar of Lebanon, I think there's only one lonely grove because it was overused, but cedar of Lebanon has expanded around the globe where it's used as a forestry tree. And there's extensive forest of cedar libanii in Turkey, native stands of it. King Solomon's temple was built of Cedrus libanii. And in Egypt, some of the royal temples are also reported to have used cedar in their construction. There's references of people flourishing like a palm tree and growing like a cedar in Lebanon. But notice the cedar tree, all the cones are held upright. The cones shatter before they come off the plant. So you won't find a cone on the ground. You'll only find pieces of the cone. And there are only 4 true cedars in the world. They grow from Lebanon to Syria to the Himalayan mountains and the island of Cyprus. The so-called red cedar of the Pacific Northwest, the incense cedar in California, and what we call cedar here in West Tennessee, they're not true cedars at all. One is a juniper, one is a chamaecyparis, and anyway, they're not cedars at all. They're not true cedars. So again, that's where the Latin names sorted out. Whenever you see the name Cedrus, you know you're dealing with one of the 4 true cedars of the world. Cedars are more closely related to pines, and they have these dense clusters of needles originating from these pegs on the branches. Anyway, they're drought tolerant, and they can get 120, 150 feet old. Cedrus atlantica, the cedars of Lebanon is not that great for us, but the Cedrus atlantica grows pretty well here in Memphis. It's called the Atlas cedar. It's from the Atlas Mountains of Algeria and Morocco. It has inch-long needles that are a wonderful blue-gray green. And the cultivar glauca is a really a widely cultivated ornamental. And there are a lot of other cultivars with pendulous or weeping habits, and I'll show you a cultivar here in a minute. Number 3 of the cedars, remember there's 4, this is number 3. This is from the Himalayan mountains in Afghanistan. This is the deodora cedar, and it can get 200 feet tall. It's widely planted. You can always tell a deodora because the top is sort of droopy and the branches sort of droop downward and sweep downward. It's got the longest needles. I say longest needles, they're only a couple of inches, but they're longer than the other cedar species. And we can grow Cedrus deodora here. There's good examples in Memphis. The thing is, you just don't need to over-irrigate them. And then this is an obscure one. This is cedar number 4, Cedrus brevifolia. It only grows on the island of Cyprus. I've never grown this. It has the shortest of all needles, like a 1/4 of an inch to a little bit over a 1/2 inch long. And if you go to the Great Lawn of in San Francisco, there's a great lawn at the San Francisco Botanical Gardens, and they grow all 4 of these species side by side. But again, only the deodora and the blue atlas grow well here. This is a blue atlas cedar in the parking lot island, unirrigated at the Dixon. And this is a dwarf cultivar that we really love called Horstman. Look at the blue-green needles on it. It's growing there with a hardy agave as well that's been in the ground outdoors, unprotected for many, many years. All right, let's talk about the Laurellus nobilis. Most of you probably know this as the bay leaf you use in cooking. If you do stock, you end up adding bay leaves, and it provides some of the aroma and taste that you get from cooking in Mediterranean and other dishes. It was esteemed by the Greeks, and it's a forest tree. It was used to crown winners in ancient games. It's kind of a plant tiara they would make out of this. They would make a wreath that you put on your head. Laurellus nobilis, the term baccalaureate means laurel berries, and it's the ancient symbol of victory. And of course, it's used with the university and education today. This plant grows in Israel in the oak forest. There's an oak forest complex in Israel that's native, and it's part of that. The laurel is also a messenger of peace, in so much like the like the olive branch, holding out a branch of laurel is a symbol of truce. So anyway, so that is the laurel that's mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned as a bay as well, not as a laurel, as a bay, but it is a laurel. Couldn't have a talk about plants of the Bible without boxwood. This is the box tree, Buxus longiflora. This is sempervirens here, but Buxus longiflora is probably the one that was native to the land of the Bible. It's, you know, a hardy evergreen tree. It's Buxus sempervirens actually goes into part of Lebanon. It's evergreen, so that was neat, and it's one of the earliest cultivated plants by Pliny the Elder. Had mentions a boxwood as one of the earliest cultivated ornamentals. In the Bible, it refers to it as ashar wood, and ashar is the box tree, and it's called boxwood because it's a very hard, dense wood that was used in carving and making little boxes. And this little medallion here is indicative of using the boxwood for that. Ashar tree. Some have even speculated that you know, that maybe the boxwood was what the timbers that Christ was crucified on were, but I suspect, you know, I said the longifloria would have been the species that was found there, and it's a rather smallish shrub, at least by today's standards. But this is why they call it boxwood, because they would make boxes to keep their valuable spices and herbs and things in. This is Buxus longiflora, and it only gets to be about 3 feet tall, so it's unlikely that the cross was made of that, but we will probably never know. Here's a plant that's mentioned in the Bible in sort of the boggy areas and in the wetlands and in the on riverbanks, on stony riverbanks, and it's naturalized down in the Florida, the United States. It's a poisonous plant called oleander. It was used in medicine. It's an evergreen shrub, and it's mentioned in the Bible as well. Another plant of sort of the lowlands and the swamplands would be the cattail. And it's a marsh and water plant. It was referred to as reed mace in the Bible. And I think this is probably what the baby Moses was hidden in. It's sometimes referred to as bulrush. And today it's even a dominant feature in the ditches and tributaries of the Nile and Lower Egypt, and just as the descriptions were in Exodus and Isaiah. A really interesting a plant that we're all familiar with. That other species grow here natively. So another wetland plant that we all know is the sweet flag. Sweet flag was an ingredient in a holy anointing oil. The stalk is dried and reduced to a powder that was used in perfumes and in ointments that you would mix with oils and anoint people's head because it has this sweet smell to it. It's sweet flag grass is what we know it as. It's a chorus is the genus. And variegated sweet flag grass is a great ornamental in Memphis. It works well, and it's almost evergreen in most winters and is a really attractive plant. And then there's a yellow form called ogon, which is a yellow form that we also like to use, but that's sweet flag grass. In Matthew, there is a reference to, in Matthew, there's a reference to the lilies of the field, and it talks about the different colors of the lilies of the field. If you think about the harsh environment that you're looking at, bulbs are well suited to a harsh environment. Some of the wild tulips are there, crocus, scilla, and some other Hyacinthia hispanica, some other plants that would grow there in the wild, in their wild form. And so that's probably what's being referred to along the roadsides, the flowers of the field. Lilies are mentioned numerous times. I think somewhere I read like 15 times in the Bible, and they occur in the Song of Solomon quite a bit. And but there's some debate over whether Lillium Candidum would be the lily of the field based on geography, location, and natural distribution of the plant. Most likely, the lily of the field was an anemone or a windflower that blooms in the spring, anemone coronaria, and they're called windflowers because the seed pods dry and they're distributed in the wind. But this was probably the lily of the field. It's what scholars suggest. Another plant that's confused among the scholars is the rose. Certainly there were species of Rosaceae and rose that grew in the Holy Lands. They would have been much like this, probably a single wild rose. But in researching it, most consensus is that the rose that's referred to in the Bible is not a rose at all, but a narcissus. So it's more like our daffodil. And this is Narcissus tazetta. And if you've ever bought paper whites, they're in the group tazetta. So they don't need chilling. They're narcissus that don't need the chilling in order to flower. And so that was probably the rose of the Bible. That's sort of consensus from several sources, is that Narcissus tazetta was the rose that's mentioned in the Bible. I mentioned bulbs being tough. One bulb that was native to the Holy Lands that's mentioned, it's called Star of Bethlehem. It's ornithogalum, and if you know anything about Latin, ornitho means bird, and galum means dung. So the common name is dove's dung. Most botanists accept the interpretation that the Star of Bethlehem is most likely the dove's dung, as in the second Second Kings, it's mentioned, and that's what they assumed the plant was. I think it gets the name because if you can imagine a rock-filled hill with this growing, it looks like the rocks are coated with dung dropped by doves and other birds, which would have been a good source for fertilizer, a natural fertilizer, much like the dove coats they use in England to harvest the manure to use in their gardens. All right, so let's move on to some herbs, drugs, and spices, including some of the incense. Aromatic herbs have played a hugely influential role in health and healing, and they're part of the lifestyle in biblical times. And just the pursuit and trade of these alone changed the existence of nations. There were routes made for trading spices. And a lot of these were used to make incense, perfumes, or ointments and things. The first one I'm going to mention is Crocus sativus. Crocus was used. This is the crocus bulb that you're familiar with. It's a species of that. This is a tiny plant with a little subterranean bulb, or actually technically a corm. And its flowers are used for spice. They're also used as a dye plant for coloring, and they thought that they had healing purposes throughout the Bible. So this is Crocus sativus. And if you look at those little anthers in there and stigmas, those are harvested by hand, and this is used for the dye and beverages. They're difficult to gather. 150 flowers produces only a single gram of saffron. So this is a labor-intensive thing, but a little pinch of that in your rice will make it yellow. So this is the saffron. So anyway, moving on to gall that is mentioned throughout the Bible, both in the Old and New Testament. Gall is actually poison hemlock. Another reason why we look at the Latin names. Poison hemlock is not poison from the hemlock tree that you see on the left of your screen. That grows here at the Dixon and grows native to Tennessee in the eastern part of the state. That is not the hemlock at all. Conium maculatum is the hemlock. And it's the toxin that Socrates ingested that took his life. The poison is especially abundant in the fruit. This plant naturally grows in Greece. and it was thought that gall was mentioned in the liquid that was given to Christ on the cross, so it may have some other properties as well. All right, so one of the gifts from the wise men was frankincense, and frankincense, the name means the true sense, or true incense, and so that's what it means. Boswellia cari. The resin from several species, there's 24 species, and the rosin or the resin from these was traded throughout the ancient world. It was part of the famous spice route from Arabia and East Africa. Incense, this is the plant. Incense is this aromatic smoke, and people thought that incense would connect the sort of the present world with the heavens, because the incense made this smoke that was a link between gods and people. There's archaeological evidence that this was used, in 200 BC. As I said, the word means frankincense means true incense. At its heyday, at around 300 BC, they said that 3,000 tons of frankincense each year was exported. Today, there's only a few hundred tons of frankincense produced in the world, so it's not as important today, but it was a key ingredient in a lot of incense. Another one of the gifts of the wise men was myrrh, and it was the most precious of all the resins, and the dried resins of several species of the genus Commiphora. These are shrubs or small trees of the region, and not all species are used for the same purpose. Some are used for medicine, and others used for fragrances. It's been touted for a long time with its healing quality.
Yes, honey. Sorry, I'm listening to something.
Okay, somebody needs to mute. The scented myrrh, Solomon's writings has references throughout, and it was used as a perfume as well. The Egyptians burned it as incense also in their temples. Myrrh was one of the ingredients offered in the vinegar when Jesus was on the cross, and so it was offered vinegar mingled with myrrh, and so there may be some opiate-like qualities or sort of pain-relieving qualities that maybe that's why it was given to Christ on the cross. So anyway, that's myrrh. So moving from the gifts of the wise men to a very curious plant that has been steeped in lore, tradition, and it's the mandrake. And it's in the Bible, it's mentioned growing along the fields. This is in the nightshade family. It's kin to potatoes and tomatoes. And it's why potatoes and tomatoes were discovered in the New World. At first, they weren't accepted in the Old World because they were related to this plant, which is known to be toxic and possibly hallucinogenic, and has a lot of, it's even associated with witchcraft and a lot of things. So anyway, it really doesn't have a stem. It's just these basal rosettes, and it has these flowers that emerge. The fruits are supposed to contain a lot of the narcotic-like qualities. Here's the fruits. They're noted in the Song of Songs, and they're produced in early summer, and apparently they smell really good, the fruit does. It's common in Greece, and they say historically it was valued for its aphrodisiac powers, especially when you soak it in wine. In fact, they called it love apple, and they believed it would help a barren woman to conceive. But interestingly enough, in the Arabians thought it was a evil plant. They called it devil's candle, and it was also Satan's fruit. Satan's apple was another name. In the Middle Ages in Europe, it was just steeped in lore and tradition. In the Middle Ages, there was a thing called doctrine of signatures, And this was the commonly held belief that if a plant looked like a body part, it must be medicine given to us by God for that body part. So this root looks like a human, and it's a long, dark root that may be several feet deep, and it can weigh several pounds. It has a human-like shape, and that just aided in its spread of superstition. In fact, it was said that if you pulled this plant up from the ground, that it would let out a shrill so loud that it would kill you. So people employed dogs to pull these roots up. Recent experiments show that mandrake may contain sedatives and aphrodisiacs, but it's mixed in with all these toxins, so it is a toxic plant. But perhaps soaking it in the wine made it more of an aphrodisiac. In the bottom corner there, that's a reference from Harry Potter, where it's associated with witchcraft. But this is the mandrake root that's mentioned in the Bible. So interestingly enough, it's associated with witchcraft, and it's also associated with witches flying. So I guess if they were hallucinating, maybe they were flying. I don't know. Here's a plant that's mentioned in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. It's aloe. This is the aloe we know, but actually the aloe in the Old Testament is aqualaria, which is another genus altogether. They derived a perfume from the bark. It's listed as with myrrh and some of these other things as spices, and they were in great demand for their fragrance and oil. It's mentioned in Numbers and Proverbs and in Psalms. And this is the tree that actually, the trunk of the tree that the bark is derived from, growing next to a bamboo here. Aqualaria. But in the New Testament, aloe vera is the aloe vera we know. Has the sword-like leaves, and it's used in medicine. We use this to treat burns. It's been used for burns since people started cultivating the plant. It was also used for embalming the dead and as a perfume for shrouds. It's also used for constipation as historically. So this is another plant that's mentioned in the Bible is capers, the caper bush. And it comes from the Hebrew word desire. And so when you see the word desire, it's referring to caper bush. It's very common and seeds around in rocks and stuff. It's a beautiful plant, but capers are only mentioned one time that I could find in the Bible. So anyway, look at that beautiful flower. When we were on our Dixon trip to Italy, we were touring a place outside of Tuscany on the hillside. This was growing. There's the fruit of the caper bush. It grows on the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem out of the rocks. The flowers bloom in midsummer, and they open in the evening, and the next morning it wilts. And then from that come these berries that you see here. And then they split open and expose the seeds. And any of you who have had lox are familiar with capers. I love capers. They're yummy. I used to think they were the flower buds, but I think they may actually be the seeds. I used to think we were eating flower buds by the shape of them. So anyway, that is the story of capers. Moving from capers, this is the last plant that I have. And like the capers, there's only one reference to this plant in the Bible, which is surprising because this would have been a common plant and is still common over many parts of the Middle East, found in the mountains, as well as long as rivers and streams. And I put it in here because from a horticultural standpoint, we love styrax. We planted several of them at the Dixon. There used to be a styrax Olea here at the Dixon. And they're wonderful May-flowering plants with these pendulous flowers. But styrax actually has a gummy resin in the sap that was very coveted. In Hosea, it's mentioned, that's the only mention of styrax in the Bible. It's referred to poplar in this verse, but looking at the poplar and the white poplar that could have been attributed to that, scholars say that it was most likely styrax that this is referring to. Here's Styrax officinalis. but it occurs one time in the Bible, but it's certainly a significant ornamental plant. There's the fruit on the styrax. And it's my understanding a resin, a gummy rubbery resin is extracted that's very useful for incense, perfumes, and other things as well. So that's Styrax officinalis. And there's the wonderful pendulous flowers on the Styrax of the creamy white flowers. So this was actually mixed with frankincense and other herbs to burn in the tabernacle. It was the tabernacle incense of the Old Testament. So it's been around and utilized for a long time. Beautiful tree. So that is my plants of the Bible. And thank you for bearing with me. I hope that wasn't too long. Again, I'm not a biblical scholar, nor do I claim to be. And I was just trying to merely understand what plants they were talking about. And one thing's for sure is there's a lot of confusion. And so I hope I left you with some understanding, and I'm sure I introduced some confusion on your part as well, but hopefully you're like me and confused on a higher level. And with that, I would love to answer questions. Maybe Lindley would be willing to read the questions to me.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dale. That was amazing. You always impress us with the amount of knowledge that you have about all of these plants from all over the world. Well, I will start first by telling you, by referring back to you talking about you and Kevin not always agreeing about whether a tree needs to come out or not. So Kevin says, Dale's first miracle will be bringing a dead tree back to life. Hasn't happened yet, but hope springs eternal. So, little message from Kevin Sharp here.
To Kevin's point, you know, Kevin wants the grounds to look really nice all the time. And I like I said, hope springs eternal. And there's been, usually, I must say, we will step up to these trees. We'll give them some love. I'll call Dr. Mark Folis. He'll come and inject them with different things to try to save them. And a lot of times, by the time the plant is under that much stress, we end up losing some of them and have to cut them down anyway. But it's sort of a ritual we go through. So, but I thought that was so funny that when I read that, it just resonated with me because it's sort of what we go through. And I started thinking about Adam with all his compost and compost teas. So anyway, thanks, Kevin.
Well, you talked a lot about olives, of course, because olives are mentioned so much in the Bible. And so I've heard that processing olives to make them edible at all is a difficult process. So do you know anything about that?
I do not. I do not know anything about processing olives. I know that most of the olives that that are consumed in biblical lands are much different from the olives that we have stuffed with pimentos here. So, but I know they have a pit on them, and I'm not sure what goes into processing olives. Maybe there's some kind of pickling or curing process, but I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, and you mentioned the big quince fruits. And I think a lot of us are used to the quince bushes we have here that do have the small fruits on them. So are the big quince fruits good to eat?
You know, the small quince fruit that is usually a multi-stem thorny plant that's kind of it catches all the garbage that blows around your yard because nobody wants to reach in there and grab the garbage out because of the thorns. You know, that has a fruit on it, and they're all related. They're all related fruits, whether it's the quince, even the apple. But that's canomeles, and there's several species of that, and that is edible. The cydonia is also edible, and my only experience with it is as a teenager working at 4-5's nursery. Mr. Casel had a grove of them, and they were growing in pots, and they had rooted into the ground. So the pots were removed, and there was a little grove of them, and they had really attractive bark. They did have spines, but the fruit was extremely large, bigger than a grapefruit. And so I think at one time, some were collected, and I saw someone who, an old friend on this that's attending this lecture, who I think took some of the seed and grew them when she worked for Barbara Taylor, who was a local gardener here. So that's the Cydonia. And so yes, to answer your question, they are edible.
Okay, and I know that we had oleander growing in the cutting gardens for a while. Is that just because we, take them in and out, or will oleander grow here?
Oleander is not hardy out of doors here. It is like some more tropical climate. I think you start to see it along the Gulf Coast. It grows in lower Alabama, Florida Panhandle, and south of there. There's signs on the road talking about the toxicity of it and that sort of thing. It's a beautiful plant, but it's not hardy here. We have planted them in the ground and let them get big in what we call the med beds here at the Dixon, but it is not a cold hardy plant for us. It's evergreen.
Okay. Well, Susie and Michael Baker want to know, do you know what gopher wood is, which is what Noah's Ark was made of?
I did not find any reference to gopher wood, but I'm going to add that to my talk. I will research gopher wood. Probably, it seems like an ark cedar would make a great, and it was abundant and plentiful. It seems like cedar would make, and I think somewhere in the scripture, there's a reference to the size of the wood. And I guess that's where the gopher wood reference is. I'll have to go back and research that. This topic is so fascinating, and I have just barely scratched the surface of it. But I would like to know what gopher wood is, or if there's a scholarly view on what that might be.
Well, Kathy Johnson wants to know something that I want to know too. So thanks for asking it. Are capers eaten straight from the pod, or must they be treated first? Do you know that?
Again, that's like the olive. I do not know. I've never eaten any. The only time I know that when I was in Italy was the first time I'd actually seen caper plants growing wild, and it was on a hillside, and they were in flower, and I knew immediately what it was. But like I said, I don't have that much experience with it. It's not something that we would grow here. So.
Okay. Well, Kathy James says something I obviously don't know enough to know about this. She says, I noticed that you avoided problems of Rose of Sharon and Balm of Gilead.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's a rabbit hole I didn't go down. Yes, that's very much so. So the Rose of Sharon that we call today is not the Rose of Sharon of the Bible. So there's debate over it anyway. So, but I didn't go down that. That's even more complicated than the apple. So anyway, yes.
So is that, is Rose of Sharon and Balm of Gilead, are they confused with each other, or what's the problem?
I don't know about Balm of Gilead. I don't know, but I do know that Rose of Sharon is mentioned numerous times in the Bible, and there's a little bit of debate over that plant as well. So I did not go down that. There were a lot of things that actually, if I were to continue clicking on my slide presentation, I've got about 25 more slides, one of which is the Rose of Sharon, but I omitted them because I just didn't have the time to dive into them, and maybe it was a little bit more obscure or not as easily accessible to the information.
Well, the last thing we have in our chat is not a question, but it's Julie Parati saying, thank you, Dale, this was great. And I echo that.
Best cheerleader. Julie is always upbeat and positive. You gotta love Julie for that.
It is true. It is true. So I'm going to say now we're going to sort of close things out. So if anybody wants to unmute and real quickly say thank you to Dale, you're welcome to do it.
Thanks, Dale. It was very informative.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope nobody's asleep. If you are, wake up.
Thank you.
All right.
All of these Munch and Learns have been great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Dale.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
It-
Dale.
Bye, everybody.
It was great hearing from you and seeing you again, Dale.
All right. Bye.
Good job, Dale.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close it out for everybody. So, bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye. You have a good
No Munch and Learn next week, so everybody can cook for Thanksgiving.
Put some
Bye.
feelings in there.